The sound of porcelain shattering on the marble floor was sharp and violent, an echo of the cruelty that had just occurred. In the center of the lavish, Sterling family living room, the elderly matriarch, Mrs. Margaret, stared at the tea stain and the shards at her feet, her body trembling, her gaze lost in confusion. Before her, Genevieve, the beautiful and implacable wife of her son, maintained a posture of restrained fury. "Again, Margaret, you are absolutely useless," Genevieve hissed her, a voice low so as not to be heard by others, but each syllable laden with a venom that wounded more than any shout. From the doorway, the young housekeeper, Maya, witnessed the scene, her heart tightening into a knot of helplessness and anger. It wasn't the first time. Since she had started working in that house 6 months ago, she had witnessed the casual cruelty with which Genevieve treated her own mother-in-law, whose memories were being stolen day by Alzheimer'S. Small humiliations, derogatory comments, a patience that ran out with frightening speed. Maya, whose job was to be invisible, felt each of those attacks as if on her own skin, an affront to the dignity of that very fragile lady. Maya's duty was to clean the floor and pretend she saw nothing, but her soul refused to obey. She had been raised by her grandmother, a strong and gentle woman who had taught her that respect for the elderly was the foundation of all character. Seeing Mrs. Margaret so vulnerable and defenseless, being treated with such contempt, activated in her a protective instinct that was stronger than the fear of losing her job. Every frightened look from Margaret was a mirror of the grandmother she had loved so much, and Maya felt that to remain silent would be to betray everything she had learned. Genevieve's cruelty escalated. She gripped Mrs. Margaret's arm with unnecessary force. "Look at the mess you've made. You are a burden, a dead weight in this house," she said, her face close to the elderly woman's, who flinched in terror. That touch, that veiled physical aggression, was the trigger. Maya's barrier of professionalism shattered. She could no longer be a passive spectator to this psychological torture. The dignity of a life could not be crushed in that way, not while she was there to witness and to fight. With firm, silent steps, Maya approached, placing herself between the two women. "Excuse me, Mrs. Sterling," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "It's time for Mrs. Margaret's medication." The nurse left clear instructions. It was a lie, an excuse, but her body acted as a shield, physically blocking the attack. She gently touched Margaret's shoulder, offering a safe harbor in the middle of that storm of hate. The act was a silent declaration of war, a choice of loyalty that she knew would have consequences. Genevieve turned, her eyes shooting daggers at Maya with disbelief and fury. "Who do you think you are?" she snarled, shocked by the maid's audacity. "You are paid to clean, not to meddle in my family's affairs. Get out of my way right now." The hierarchy of the house had been challenged. The help's invisibility had become a confrontational presence, and Genevieve, accustomed to blind obedience, would not tolerate this insubordination. The living room suddenly became a battlefield for control and dignity. Maya did not back down. She stood her ground, her gaze locked with Genevieve's. "I am the person who cares for Mrs. Margaret. When you are not here," she replied, her voice low but unshakable, "and my job is to ensure that she is safe and at peace. And right now, she is neither." The response wasn't insolent. It was a declaration of her human duty, a duty that for her was above any employment contract. She was there to care, and care, in its purest form, included protection from the family itself. It was at this exact moment of peak tension that Edward Sterling, the master of the house, walked in. Returning early from a meeting, he was drawn by the heavy silence that had followed the sound of something breaking. He stopped in the doorway, and the scene froze him. His mother, huddled and frightened, his wife, rigid with fury, and the young housekeeper, standing between them, an unlikely guardian, with an expression of defiance and protection. He didn't understand what had happened, but he felt the electricity in the air. the scent of a deep conflict that had erupted in his absence. Genevieve was the first to break the silence, her voice suddenly transformed into a victim's lament. "Edward, darling, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, pointing at Maya. "This insolent girl. I tried to discipline your mother for another one of her messes, and she interfered, challenging me in my own home. I demand that you fire her right now." The accusation was thrown. The trap was set. Edward was at the center, forced to choose between his powerful, cruel wife and the strange, moving courage of the housekeeper who, for some reason, was risking everything to protect his sick mother. A housekeeper who risks everything for her boss's mother. A cruel wife and a husband forced to choose a side. What will Edward do? Subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you believe compassion should overcome power, and send a message of support to the courageous Maya and the fragile Mrs. Margaret. The silence that followed Genevieve's demand was heavy, electric. All eyes turned to Edward, the master of the house, the judge of this unequal dispute. Genevieve stared at him with the certainty of one who expects obedience, while Maya looked at him with a challenging dignity, not backing down an inch. In that instant, Edward was not a businessman, but a man forced to confront the moral landscape of his own home. The choice seemed simple, the wife or the maid. But as he looked at his mother's trembling face, he realized the choice was actually between convenience and conscience. Ignoring his wife and the housekeeper, Edward took a step forward and knelt before his mother. With a tenderness he hadn't shown in a long time, he took her hand. "Mother, are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft. Mrs. Margaret, frightened, just nodded, her eyes welling with tears. Edward's gesture, so simple and so public, was a silent bombshell. He did not obey Genevieve's order. Instead, he prioritized the victim, a subtle act of rebellion that redefined the balance of power in that room. He was, for the first time, choosing his mother's side. "This conversation is over for now," he announced to the two women, his voice now firm, that of someone taking back command. "Maya, please take my mother to her room and make sure she calms down. Genevieve, you and I will talk later." He stood up, ending the scene with an authority that wasn't cruel, but definitive. He left behind a wife, shocked by his disobedience, and a housekeeper surprised by the unexpected stay of her sentence. He hadn't absolved Maya, but he had also refused to be Genevieve's executioner, leaving the tension hanging, unbreathable. Maya took refuge in her small room at the back of the mansion, her heart still hammering against her ribs. She expected to be summoned at any moment, her dismissal a certainty. She sat on the edge of her bed, and her gaze fell upon the only photograph on her nightstand, herself as a child, hugging a lady with a sweet smile and kind eyes. Her grandmother, the woman who had raised her, who had been her only safe harbor in the world. The image transported her to a simpler time, to a small house where the only luxury was the unconditional love she received. Orphaned at a very young age, Maya was raised by this grandmother, a woman of silent strength and infinite kindness. It was from her that she learned the value of compassion, the importance of caring for the most fragile, the dignity that exists in every life, no matter how humble. Her grandmother was her compass, her example, the foundation of her entire character. She left her no material inheritance, but she left her a legacy far more valuable, the ability to see the humanity in others, especially when the world chose not to look. The most painful memory, however, was of the illness. She watched her grandmother's brilliant mind fade away, devoured by the same confusing fog that now inhabited Mrs. Margaret's eyes. Maya, still a teenager, became her devoted caregiver, a role reversal she took on with a fierce dedication. She learned to have patience with lost memories, to find joy in the rare moments of lucidity, to defend her grandmother from the world's incomprehension and impatience, becoming her guardian, her living memory. On her deathbed, Her grandmother made a final request, her voice a fragile whisper. "Promise me, my dear, promise you'll never forget the old ones. Promise you'll always be a voice for those the world can no longer hear." That promise became Maya's life mission, a sacred oath that guided her every step. It was the reason she couldn't simply turn her back on injustice, no matter how frightening the consequences of standing up and fighting might be. Back in the present, looking at the impersonal walls of her room in the mansion, she understood the force that had driven her. In Mrs. Margaret, she didn't just see her employer's mother, she saw the face of her own grandmother. She saw the same vulnerability, the same frightened confusion, the same occasional spark of the person she once was. Protecting Margaret wasn't just an act of kindness toward a stranger, it was a way of continuing to protect the memory and dignity of the woman who gave her everything. It was a debt of love she would pay for the rest of her life. She finally understood that her reaction to Genevieve had not been a calculated act of courage, but a reflex of her soul. Challenging the lady of the house, risking her job, her roof over her head, all of that was secondary. The only thing that mattered was fulfilling the promise made to her grandmother. She could lose everything she had, but she would not lose herself. She would not betray the legacy of compassion that was her true and only inheritance. And with that certainty, a strange calm washed over her. She was ready to face whatever came next, for she knew she was fighting for the right thing. The next morning, the Sterling mansion was an ice field. Genevieve moved through the house with a polished coldness, acting as if the previous night's confrontation hadn't happened, a tactic to nullify the event's importance. Edward, however, woke up a different man. The promise he had made in the silence of his mother's room had solidified into an unshakable resolve. He did not have breakfast with his wife. Instead, he went looking for Maya, finding her in the garden, helping Mrs. Margaret with a slow, careful walk in the morning sun. The scene, so simple and so full of peace, reinforced his decision. He approached, and Maya instinctively tensed, expecting the conversation that would lead to her dismissal. But Edward's words surprised her. "Maya, I'd like to apologize," he said, his voice sincere, "for my wife's behavior and especially for my own inaction. What you did yesterday was an act of courage and decency, and I failed to support you." The apology, coming from the powerful Edward Sterling, was a seismic event, a shattering of all hierarchies and expectations. He wasn't speaking as a boss, but as an ashamed man. "I'm not going to fire you," he continued, to Maya's shock. "On the contrary, I need your help. I want to make you a proposition." He then offered her a new position. She would no longer be a housekeeper with multiple duties. She would be Mrs. Margaret's full-time companion. Her only job would be to ensure his mother's well-being, safety, and above all, happiness. He offered her a salary that was triple what she was earning, a demonstration that he finally understood the true value of the work she did, a value that could not be measured in clean floors, but in restored dignity. Maya was speechless, the generosity of the offer moving her. She saw in Edward's eyes not just an employer, but a desperate son trying to right a wrong. "I accept, sir. It would be an honor," she replied, her voice choked. In that moment, a silent pact was sealed between them. It was no longer an employment contract, it was an alliance to protect Margaret, to bring some warmth to that cold house. An unlikely partnership between the billionaire and the housekeeper, united by a common purpose that was greater than their differences. Genevieve, who watched the scene from her bedroom window, felt the venom of fury rise in her throat. The conversation didn't look like a dismissal, it looked like a promotion. The way her husband looked at the maid, with a mixture of respect and admiration, was an affront. He had not only defied her the night before, now he was actively elevating the help to a position of importance within the house. She felt her control over her husband and her home slipping through her fingers, and the one responsible for it was that insolent young woman. Edward began to put his promise into action. He cancelled his afternoon meeting schedule, an unprecedented act, and announced he would be spending the afternoon with his mother. At first he was clumsy, a stranger in his own mother's universe. He would sit in silence in her room's armchair, while Maya interacted with Margaret with a naturalness that he envied. He was relearning how to be a son, a slow and sometimes painful process, full of silences and the frustration of not being able to immediately connect with the woman who raised him. It was Maya who showed him the way. "Try with music, sir," she suggested softly one day, putting an old vinyl record onto play. She always loved this song. The familiar melody filled the room, and something miraculous happened. Mrs. Margaret's eyes, previously vacant, gained a spark of recognition. She began to hum quietly, and a lucid, happy smile lit up her face. It was a fleeting but powerful glimpse of the woman she had been. Edward felt his eyes burn with tears. Music was a key he had never thought to use. He began to participate. He brought out old photo albums and, with Maya's help, would sit beside his mother, showing her faces from the past. "Do you remember this day, Mom? Your wedding?" Sometimes she seemed to recognize, squeezing his hand. Other times she would just look at the photos with a childlike curiosity, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was there, present, sharing his memories, rebuilding her history for her. In those afternoons, he learned more about his mother and about himself than he had in his entire adult life. Genevieve watched the new routine with growing contempt. The alliance between her husband and the maid excluded her, making her a stranger in her own home. She tried to sabotage those moments of connection, interrupting with complaints about the garden, questions about business, or acidic comments about the futility of trying to revive the dead. She saw Edward's dedication to his mother not as an act of love, but as a weakness, a sentimental distraction that was pulling him away from the world of power and ambition that was the only one she valued. Edward, however, no longer gave in. Every attempt at interruption by Genevieve was met with a calm firmness. "We're busy right now, Genevieve," he would say, without taking his attention off his mother. Each small defense of this new, sacred ritual was a victory for his transformation and a crushing defeat for his wife. He was building a wall, not around himself, but around his mother and Maya, a refuge of peace within the mansion that his wife could no longer invade with her toxicity. With each passing day, the bond between Edward and his mother grew stronger, and his admiration for Maya deepened. He saw in her not just a competent caregiver, but a teacher. She was teaching him the language of patience, of empathy, of unconditional love. He, the master of the corporate universe, was a humble apprentice in the art of being human. Maya's presence in his home, which had begun as a practical solution, had become the moral compass that was reorienting his entire life, showing him a path away from the loneliness of his wealth. Genevieve, realizing that her direct attacks and sarcasm no longer worked, retreated. But her withdrawal was not a surrender. It was a change of strategy. As she watched her husband, her mother-in-law, and the maid laughing together while looking at a photo album, the jealousy and resentment in her heart crystallized into a colder, more dangerous plan. If she couldn't get rid of the maid, perhaps she needed to get rid of the source of the problem. The old woman, with her illness and her ability to awaken compassion in Edward, was the real obstacle to her perfect life. In the following weeks, a tense peace settled over the Sterling mansion. Edward, true to his promise, became a present figure in his mother's life. The afternoons in the garden, once an exclusive ritual between Margaret and Maya, now included him. He was rediscovering his mother not as the strong figure of his childhood, but as the fragile, sweet woman the illness had revealed. Edward's transformation was real and moving. He was healing from his own neglect, one day at a time, under the watchful, guiding eye of Maya, who had become the moral compass of that house. Genevieve, realizing that direct hostility only pushed her husband further away, changed tactics. With the cunning of a predator, she put on the mask of compassion. She began to join them in the garden, bringing flowers for her mother-in-law, complimenting her dress, forcing a tenderness she did not feel. Edward, in his eagerness to see his family united, wanted to believe in the change. He saw his wife making an effort, and a part of him filled with a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. Maya, however, was not fooled. She saw the ice behind Genevieve's smile, the calculated mechanics in every gesture of affection. She began to notice small, cruel sabotages. Margaret's favorite shawl, which calmed her, would mysteriously disappear. A photo album that made her happy would be moved. They were small, almost imperceptible acts, designed to create confusion and anguish in Margaret's already fragile mind, small tortures that only Maya, with her constant attention, could perceive. She knew Genevieve was playing a dangerous game, but she had no way to prove it. The focus of Genevieve's sabotage soon became Margaret's medication. She began to insist on administering her mother-in-law's pills personally, an act she disguised as help to lighten Maya's load. Edward, seeing it as a sign of goodwill, allowed it. Maya, however, watched with a heavy heart. She noticed a disturbing pattern. On the days Genevieve handled the medication, Mrs. Margaret would become visibly more agitated at night or excessively drowsy during the day. The elderly woman's health seemed to fluctuate according to the hands that gave her the pills. With the groundwork laid, Genevieve began to plant the seed of fear in Edward's mind. "Darling, I'm so worried about your mother," she would say, her voice full of a fake anguish. "She seems to be getting worse. Don't you think? More confused, more unstable. I'm afraid she'll hurt herself. Maybe this house with so many stairs is no longer the safest place for her." Every word was a drop of poison, a subtle suggestion that the only loving solution would be to remove Margaret from that environment, to place her in a more appropriate institution. The stage for the final blow was set with the excuse of a business dinner. Genevieve insisted on hosting some of Edward's most important partners at the mansion. "We need to maintain our social life, darling. It's important for business," she argued. Edward, feeling guilty for his recent distance from work and wanting to believe in his wife's goodwill, reluctantly agreed. Maya, upon learning of the event, felt a chill. A formal dinner was the perfect setting for the kind of disaster Genevieve seemed to be orchestrating. On the night of the dinner, shortly before the guests arrived, Maya saw Genevieve enter Margaret's room with the evening medication tray. "You can leave it, dear. I'll take care of this today," Genevieve told Maya, dismissing her with a smile. "You have much to do with the dinner." Maya hesitated, a terrible foreboding squeezing her chest, but she couldn't disobey a direct order. She just watched from a distance as Genevieve handed the pills and a glass of water to her mother-in-law, the gesture looking more like someone setting a trap than someone providing care. The disaster occurred during the main course. Mrs. Margaret, who was seated at the table with the guests, began to show signs of acute confusion. She started talking loudly, calling for people who weren't there, looking at the ceiling as if seeing things. Suddenly, she stood up, disoriented, and in a clumsy movement. Her arm knocked over a large crystal vase, which shattered on the floor with a deafening crash. The dining room plunged into a shocked silence, all eyes fixed on the elderly lady who was now crying, frightened by the very chaos she had created. Genevieve's performance was flawless. She rushed to her mother-in-law's side, hugging her, her face a mask of pure pain and exhaustion. "Oh, Mother, it's all right, it's not your fault," she said, while casting a look of despair at the guests, a look that clearly communicated, "See the burden I carry every day." She was the personification of the devoted, suffering daughter-in-law. Edward, mortified by the scene, by the public humiliation, felt his wife's argument solidify in his mind. Maybe she was right. Maybe his mother was no longer safe at home. The guests left quickly, with hurried excuses and pitying glances. The evening, which was supposed to be a social triumph for Genevieve, became a triumph of her cruel strategy. "I warned you, Edward," she said, crocodile tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. "She's getting worse. It's dangerous. For her own sake, we have to do something." Her words manipulated him, using his love for his mother as a weapon to convince him to abandon her. He was cornered, her twisted logic seeming like the only way out. Later, while helping a now sedated Mrs. Margaret to bed, Maya felt the cold certainty in her heart. That crisis had not been natural. Margaret's confusion had been too acute and sudden, different from her usual pattern. The timing during an important dinner was too perfect. Genevieve's performance too polished. She had no proof, only intuition, the deep conviction of someone who intimately knows the person she cares for. She knew, with every fiber of her being, that this had been a deliberately orchestrated act of malice. The seed of the turning point for Maya was planted that night. She understood that she was no longer fighting against neglect or prejudice. She was fighting against an active and dangerous plot to remove Mrs. Margaret from that house and from their lives. Her mission changed. It was no longer just to care, it was to protect. It was no longer just to be Edward's ally. It was to be his eyes, his conscience. She had to find a way to prove what Genevieve was doing before Edward, blinded by manipulation and fear, made a decision he would regret forever. Genevieve's malice knows no bounds, and she has just cornered Edward and Margaret. Maya suspects the truth but has no proof. Subscribe to the channel to see how she will unmask this plan, and comment, have you ever had a strong intuition that something was wrong, even without being able to prove it? In the days following the disastrous dinner party, the atmosphere in the mansion became somber and heavy. Edward, convinced of his mother's rapid deterioration, sank into a resigned sadness. He spent his days on the phone with doctors and administrators of luxury nursing homes, arranging what he believed to be the inevitable and responsible next step. Genevieve, for her part, played the role of the supportive wife with chilling perfection, consoling her husband while secretly savoring the victory of her cruel plan. Margaret's departure from the house was now a matter of time, a conclusion that seemed inescapable to everyone but one person. Maya, however, operated with a new and dangerous clarity. Her intuition had transformed into an absolute certainty. She began a silent, risky investigation, watching Genevieve like a hawk. She confirmed her pattern. Margaret's worst episodes of confusion invariably happened about an hour after Genevieve gave her the special medication, which she kept in a small pillbox on her vanity, not in the official medicine cabinet. Maya knew that the proof of the crime was inside that little box, a secret she had to expose before it was too late. She knew she needed one of those pills. The risk was immense. If she were caught, Genevieve would not only fire her but could accuse her of theft, destroying her reputation forever. She spent 2 days planning, observing the house's routine, looking for a loophole, for a single moment of distraction. The opportunity, she decided, would have to be created. She would need a diversion, a small, controlled chaos that would give her the precious seconds she needed to act without being noticed. The plan was dangerous, but the alternative, allowing Margaret to be drugged and exiled, was unthinkable. The chosen moment was the following afternoon, as Genevieve prepared to give Margaret her medication before their daily walk in the garden. Maya, carrying a tray with a teapot and cups, approached the two in the living room. At the exact instant Genevieve opened the small pillbox, Maya pretended to trip, sending the tray crashing to the floor with a clatter of breaking porcelain. The noise was loud and shocking. Genevieve turned, irritated by the interruption and the maid's incompetence. It was only 3 seconds of distraction. While Genevieve yelled at her, Maya, already on her knees to clean up the mess, with a swift, practiced move, reached for the small end table where the pillbox lay open. With her heart in her throat, she took one of the small white pills and hid it in her palm, replacing it with a similarly shaped piece of a mint she had prepared. "1,000 apologies, madam," she stammered, the performance of a terrified employee hiding the audacity of a detective. Genevieve, furious, dismissed her with a wave, not noticing the switch. The next day, on her day off, Maya took 2 buses to a distant neighborhood on the other side of the city where no one would know her. She entered a small local pharmacy, the kind run by the same pharmacist for decades. With the pill in her hand, she approached the counter, her heart pounding. She made up a story, saying she'd found the pill in her nephew's coat pocket and was worried. The pharmacist, an elderly gentleman with glasses and a keen eye, took the pill and examined it with a magnifying glass. He consulted a large, thick pharmaceutical reference book, its pages yellowed with age. He flipped through for a few minutes, and then his expression changed. He looked up at Maya, and the seriousness on his face chilled her. "My dear, where did you find this?" he asked, his voice low and grave. "This is no candy. It's a powerful sedative used in psychiatric cases. In an elderly person, especially with dementia, this can cause extreme confusion, hallucinations, and agitation. It's a poison for a fragile mind." The confirmation was like a punch to Maya's gut. Her suspicion was real, and the truth was even more monstrous than she had imagined. Genevieve wasn't just being cruel. She was actively drugging and poisoning her mother-in-law to simulate a rapid decline and justify her institutionalization. It was an act of calculated, cold-hearted evil. The pharmacist, noticing the shock on Maya's face, wrote down the name of the medication and its effects on a piece of paper. "Be careful with this," he said, handing her the note. "This is very serious." With the proof in hand, Maya returned to the mansion, feeling a mixture of terror and determination. She needed to show this to Edward, and she needed to be quick. She ran to his office, but the door was closed. She could hear voices inside. She waited outside, anxiety consuming her. Minutes later, a man in a suit came out carrying a briefcase. It was the director of the luxury nursing home. Edward's decision had already been made. Her time had run out. She entered the office without knocking. Edward was sitting at his desk, a pen in his hand, about to sign a stack of documents. They were his mother's admission forms. The relief on his face at having finally made a responsible decision was evident. He looked up, annoyed by the interruption. "What is it, Maya?" "I'm busy." This was the moment. The last chance to save Margaret. The last chance to open the eyes of the man who was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, deceived by the woman who slept beside him. "Don't sign that paper," Maya said, her voice trembling but filled with an unshakable strength. She walked to his desk and placed the small white pill and the pharmacist's note in front of him, right on top of the contracts. "Before you send your mother away, sir, you need to know what kind of medication your wife has been giving her every day." The words hung in the air, an accusation so grave, so unthinkable, that Edward's world seemed to stop spinning for an instant. He took the note, his eyes scanning the pharmacist's handwriting, reading the words: powerful sedative, hallucinations, extreme confusion. He looked at the pill, and then all the pieces clicked into place in his mind in an explosion of horrible clarity. His mother's sudden decline, Genevieve's concern, the perfectly timed disaster at the dinner party, the pressure to institutionalize her. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a plan, a monstrous, calculated conspiracy. The woman he loved was poisoning his mother. At that exact moment, Genevieve entered the office, Maid'S, triumphant smile on her face. "Darling, have you decided yet?" She saw the pill on the desk and the look on Edward's face, a mixture of horror and an icy fury she had never seen before. Her smile froze, her mask of compassion shattered, exposing the cold, cruel truth in her eyes. The game was over. The truth exposed on the mahogany desk in the form of a small white pill hung in the air like a death sentence. Edward lifted his gaze from the pharmacist's note and stared at his wife. The fury in his eyes was cold and sharp, the fury of a man whose trust had been completely annihilated. "What is this, Genevieve?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "What kind of sick game have you been playing with my mother?" Genevieve's mask crumbled. Initial shock gave way to defiant denial. "It's her lie," she spat, pointing at Maya. "This girl is trying to tear us apart. She stole one of my tranquilizers to make up this story." But the lie found no purchase. Edward was no longer the confused, manipulable man of days past. The clarity in his eyes was that of someone finally seeing the truth behind years of subtle manipulation. "No," he said, standing up. "The game is over, Genevieve." His calmness was more terrifying than any shout. "You didn't just humiliate and mistreat a defenseless old woman, you drugged her. You poisoned my mother in my own house." Each word was a nail in the coffin of their marriage, a final verdict from which there was no appeal. Genevieve's castle of appearances was crumbling under the weight of her own wickedness. Sensing her power slipping away, Genevieve resorted to the last weapon she had left, the threat. "If you believe this maid over me, I want a divorce," she declared, "and I will drag this family's name through the mud. I'll tell every newspaper about your affair with the help, about how you neglected your own mother. I will destroy you." But the threat, which once would have paralyzed him with fear, now sounded hollow. Edward just looked at her with a cold pity. "Do whatever you want, Genevieve, but know that I will also tell my story, and I will show everyone the proof of what you did to my mother." He picked up the phone on his desk. "Security," he said into the intercom. "Please escort Mrs. Sterling off the property and ensure she takes nothing but her personal belongings." The shock on Genevieve's face was absolute. She was no longer the queen of this castle. She was an intruder being expelled. As the guards escorted her out, she cast one last look of pure hatred at Maya. But Maya felt no triumph, only an immense, tired sadness for the darkness that inhabited that woman's heart. The mansion door closed, and with it, a chapter of toxicity and pain. In the silence that followed, Edward and Maya were left alone in the office. He finally sat down, his body heavy with the exhaustion of the battle. He looked at Maya, the young woman who had risked everything, and felt a wave of gratitude and shame. "Maya, he began, but the words felt inadequate. "I'm so sorry for not believing you, for letting all of this happen. I was blind." The confession was an act of humility the old Edward would never have been capable of. He was stripping away his arrogance, showing her the truth of his regret. Maya, seeing the genuine pain on his face, felt her heart fill with compassion. "You weren't to blame, sir," she said softly. "She manipulated you. The important thing is that now you know the truth, and Mrs. Margaret is safe." The generosity of her forgiveness moved him even more. He stood up and walked over to her. "Don't call me sir anymore. My name is Edward, and what you did today goes far beyond any job. You saved my mother in a way I can never repay." He was redefining their relationship, breaking the barriers of hierarchy. "I insist on rewarding you," he continued. "I want you to accept not only the position of my mother's official guardian, but I want to fund your education. Nursing, medicine, whatever you want. You have a gift for caring for people, Maya, a gift the world needs and one that I was lucky enough to find." The offer was a recognition of her true worth, an attempt not just to repair the wrong done to her, but to honor the vocation she embodied. It was his way of saying that he saw her, that he finally saw the extraordinary woman behind the uniform. In the following days, a new peace settled in the Sterling mansion. With Genevieve gone, the heavy atmosphere of fear and judgment dissipated. Edward's first order of business was to call in a new, independent geriatrician. The doctor examined Margaret, reviewed her medication, and confirmed Maya's suspicions. She was being severely over-medicated, the doctor explained. What you saw was not a decline of the disease, but the effects of chemical intoxication. With the correct treatment, we can see significant improvement. And the improvement came. Under Maya's care and with the new medication, Margaret began to awaken. The fog of confusion that enveloped her started to lift. The episodes of agitation disappeared, replaced by long periods of a serene calm. She began to smile more, to interact, to show glimpses of the witty woman she had once been. The recovery was slow, but each small progress was celebrated by Edward and Maya as a great victory, one more step away from the darkness in which Genevieve had plunged her. Edward dove headfirst into his mother's care. He rediscovered the pleasure of simply being by her side, reading aloud the novels she had so loved, or just holding her hand while they listened to classical music. Maya was his guide in this new territory, teaching him how to communicate with his mother through gestures, touch, and patience. He learned to celebrate the moments of lucidity and to welcome the moments of confusion with the same love. He was no longer just fulfilling an obligation, he was reconnecting, rebuilding a relationship he thought he had lost forever. The Serge mansion, once a symbol of cold wealth, became a refuge of healing. Mrs. Margaret's laughter, increasingly frequent, filled the hallways. The garden, once a pristine and untouched scenery, was now the place where she and Maya tended to the flowers, and where Edward often joined them, getting his hands dirty. The house was finally becoming a home, not because of the presence of a traditional family, but because of the presence of three souls who together were learning to care for each other, to heal the wounds of the past with the silent medicine of affection. The bond between Edward and Maya deepened, transforming into a partnership based on mutual trust and admiration. He admired her strength and compassion. She, in turn, saw the transformation of a man who, by allowing himself to be vulnerable, had discovered his true strength. The long conversations they had at the end of the day about Margaret's progress, about their own dreams and fears, were weaving between them a bond that neither had expected. A new feeling, born of complicity and respect, began to blossom in the garden of their lives. One day, Margaret had a moment of surprising clarity. She was looking at an old photo of her late husband and, turning to Edward, said, "Your father would be so proud of the man you've become." The words, lucid and full of love, hit Edward with full force. He hugged his mother, tears streaming freely, not of sadness, but of deep gratitude. He looked over her shoulder and saw Maya, smiling at him from the doorway. In that moment, he knew that his happiness, his mother's happiness, the peace of that house, was all intrinsically linked to this young woman. Edward's transformation did not go unnoticed. His business partners noticed a calmer, more centered, more human man. He was still a brilliant businessman, but now his ambition was tempered by compassion. He began to invest in social projects, to use his influence to promote causes related to elder care. The personal crisis had made him a better leader, more aware of the impact of his actions on the world. He was using his power not just to build wealth, but to build a legacy of dignity. Genevieve, for her part, faced the consequences of her actions. The divorce was swift and discreet, but Edward's terms were relentless. Without access to his fortune and with her social reputation in ruins after the details of what she did to her mother-in-law leaked, she found herself isolated. The world of luxury and appearances she so valued closed its doors to her. Her fall was a silent but powerful reminder that true strength does not lie in the power to humiliate, but in the capacity to love, and that malice, sooner or later, consumes itself. Maya, with Edward's support, started nursing school. The routine was demanding, balancing her studies with Margaret's care, but she had never felt so fulfilled. She was no longer the little maid. She was a future professional, a woman in control of her own destiny, whose worth was recognized and celebrated. The dream that had seemed so distant was now her reality, a reality built not on luck, but on her own integrity, courage, and the kindness of a man who had learned to see beyond appearances. One afternoon, as they were walking in the garden, Edward stopped and took Maya's hand. The gesture was natural, as if they had done it 1,000 times. "Maya," he said, "you came into this house as an employee, but you became the teacher. You taught me how to be a son. Again, taught me how to be a parent to my own mother." He looked at her, his heart overflowing with a feeling he was no longer afraid to name. "You taught me how to love again, and I think I'm in love with you." His confession didn't surprise her. She felt the same, a love that had grown silently, nurtured by admiration and complicity. "Me too, Edward," she admitted, her voice a whisper. "I also fell in love with the man behind the millionaire. There were no fireworks, no cinematic kiss. There was only the calm, deep certainty of two souls who, after going through their own hells, had found in each other a refuge, a safe harbor, a mature and unlikely love, born from the most unexpected of seeds." The house, once cold, now pulsed with a new life. Mrs. Margaret, though still navigating the mists of her condition, was surrounded by a love that was the best of all therapies. Her smiles were the greatest reward for Edward and Maya. They had become a family, not one defined by blood ties or social conventions, but forged in crisis, compassion, and the daily choice to care for one another. A family of three, united by a common purpose, to ensure that Margaret's days were filled with dignity, peace, and much, much affection. Edward, when he looked at Maya, no longer saw the housekeeper he once feared. He saw his partner, his confidant, the woman who had saved him from himself. He understood that the real transformation wasn't about changing the world, but about having the courage to change oneself. And he, thanks to her, had become the man his mother always knew he could be. Their journey was far from a fairy tale, but it was real, and for that reason, infinitely more valuable. Maya, for her part, looked at her life with grateful wonder. The poor girl who dreamed of being a nurse, who had lost the grandmother she so loved, now had everything she had ever wanted: the chance to study, a career with purpose, and most importantly, a family to love and be loved by. She had entered that mansion seeking only a job, a means of survival, and in the process she found a life. The pain of her past had not disappeared, but it was now balanced by an immense joy. The silent refuge that Edward had built for his mother ended up becoming a refuge for them all. A place where wounds could be exposed without fear of judgment, where vulnerability was met with affection, and where love was the main language. They had learned that true strength is not in never falling, but in the courage to get up, to admit one's own mistakes, and to open oneself to the possibility of a new beginning, no matter how broken one is. And together, they were rebuilding, piece by piece. 2 years later, the Saturday afternoon sun illuminated a different garden. Not that of the Sterling mansion, but of the newly inaugurated Margaret House, a care center for the elderly with Alzheimer's that was the most advanced and humane in the country. The project, funded by Edward and directed by Maya, now a nurse graduated with honors, was the materialization of the promise he had made to his mother. It was a sanctuary of dignity, a place where memory was treated with the reverence and affection that Maya had once dreamed of for her own grandmother. And on that day, the garden wasn't just for the residents, it was the stage for a wedding. The ceremony was a celebration of their journey. Instead of an opulent church, they chose the heart of their legacy. The guests were a mixture of worlds. Edward's business partners, sitting next to Maya's old neighbors, all united to witness the union. Mrs. Margaret, the guest of honor, sitting in her wheelchair in the front row, wore a light blue dress and a serene smile. In a rare, precious moment of lucidity, as Maya walked towards him, she turned to her son, held his hand and whispered, "Your father would be proud." The vows they exchanged were not just promises of love, but a pact of purpose. You taught me that a man's true worth is not in what he builds for himself, but in what he does for others, Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. I promise to be your partner in compassion, today and always. Maya, with tears of joy in her eyes, replied, You gave me the chance to turn my pain into healing. I promise to honor that chance by caring for you, for our family, and for every soul that passes through this house with all the love in my heart. As they walked through the garden after the ceremony, hand in hand, they saw the result of their struggle. They saw residents being treated with a tenderness that was the antithesis of Genevieve's cruelty. They saw other Mayas, nurses and caregivers trained under her philosophy, treating other Margarets with the dignity they all deserved. Their story had ceased to be a private drama and had become a model, proof that it was possible to create a care environment that honored humanity above all else. Their legacy was alive, pulsating in that garden. Genevieve's life, on the other hand, had become a silent echo of her own bitterness. After a divorce that left her with a considerable fortune, but without the social standing she so valued, she found herself isolated. The world of luxury and appearances she once manipulated with such ease turned its back on her, shamed by the crudeness of her actions, which the scandal had exposed. She lived in a luxurious penthouse, but she was profoundly alone, a prisoner in a gilded cage, a constant reminder that cruelty, in the end, is the shortest path to loneliness. That evening, after the party, Edward and Maya stood alone on the terrace of Margaret House, looking at the city lights. You know, he said, I spent years building an empire, believing that power was the most important thing. But the greatest strength I've ever known wasn't in a boardroom. It was in a young housekeeper who refused to be silent in the face of injustice. He embraced her. You saved my mother, but you also saved me from myself. You were my silent refuge. The story of the Sterling family became a lesson about the unexpected ways redemption can take. It showed that sometimes the bravest act is not to close a big deal, but simply to refuse to look away from another person's pain. Maya, the housekeeper who dared to have a voice, not only saved a woman, she redeemed a man, healed a family, and built a legacy of compassion. Together, they proved that true nobility is not in a last name or a bank account, but in the courage to protect the vulnerable, transforming pain into a purpose greater than life itself. A story that teaches us that a single act of courage can change the world. What did you think of Maya and Edward's journey? Leave your sincere opinion in the comments, like the video if you were moved, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. We're preparing a new one for you tomorrow.